Now, Toyota's GT86 brought back a lot of excitement to the Toyota brand. It was a daily drivable sports car, or at least that's what Toyota claimed. The only problem was that as a sports car, it just didn't have enough power. So for the new generation, there is now a bigger engine with no torque flat spot, as well as this gorgeous svelte body pulled over a relatively taut and tight little chassis. However, with this particular manual model, not everything is as it seems, as we'll discover in this video. My name is Ayman I. Abdullah, this is Malaysian Motoring, and this is our review of the 2024 Toyota GR86 manual. Now with the new generation GR86, we now get a larger engine up front. So the 2-litre boxer is out, and now there's a 2.4-litre boxer. As a result, there is now more power and, more importantly, more torque, with power still going to the rear wheels via a 6-speed manual transmission in this particular model. Now, in terms of overall aesthetics, naturally going from the first to second generation, lots of things have changed on the GR86. This front end, for example, is now a lot more menacing than before, and it now comes with what Toyota claims to be a functional matrix mesh grille. You get these lovely L-shaped elements on the side of the bumper in order to make the car look a little bit wider and a little bit lower, and overall I think the front end treatment does look rather successful. Now you now get full LED headlights flanking this lovely long bonnet, which also comes with automatic high beam on the automatic model, but on this model it does not. However, you do still get LED indicators, which is always nice, and there are also front headlight washers, although for the life of me I can't get them to switch on. But I think it's from this angle where the new GR86 looks really, really good, because now those very fluid lines over the front wheels, which bleed out into these huge haunches, which are then bisected by that beautiful air intake there and this very svelte, very gentle roofline. I don't know, man, this is just a really good looking car. I appreciate the fact that it all looks very proportionate. It doesn't look stubby like the Supra. Interestingly, the GR86 actually has a longer wheelbase and is longer overall than the Supra, which perhaps explains why this car is able to offer rear seats for, like, small people, I guess. There are actually ISOFIX mounts back there as well, should you want to torture small children. Now, the other detail that I quite like on this are the wheels. So these are 18-inch alloy wheels wrapped in Michelin Pilot Sport 5 tires, very aggressive, very high performance wheels, and the design is very similar to what we've seen from the GR Yaris, and so I do appreciate that sort of tying in from one model to another. The other little quirk on this car that I quite appreciate is the fuel filler cap, because it's not round, it's sort of weirdly shaped. I just think it's kind of cute. But arguably, this view is perhaps the most important, simply because GR86 owners will be showing this view off to most people on the motorway. And as far as I'm concerned, this is a much better resolved design than the previous generation. For starters, these new LED tail lights look a lot sharper than before, and I love the way that they meet all the way across by this little piece of black trim here. I love this built-in ducktail spoiler. I love the lower diffuser element with the huge exhaust exits, and I just think this car looks fantastic. I love that the rear view camera has been integrated into the design as well, rather than having like a separate unit down here. And unlike the Supra, there is actually a button to release the tailgate. Now, unfortunately, that's where the good news ends, because once you open the tailgate, you will discover that Toyota has made the very strange decision of offering a full-size spare in the GR86, which then eats into boot space. There's this rather shoddy-looking cover over the damn thing, because it actually sits proud of the boot floor. And as a result, it means that the shape is weird, and trying to put luggage in this will also be a rather strange affair. As you can see, I've had to shove my backpack all the way into the corner, simply because putting it on the wheel feels a little weird. Now, the opening itself is also not very large. I still maintain that the Supra might be slightly more practical in real-world applications, but the rear seats in this car do fold, and they fold flat, which means you have even more space in this than you would in the Supra if you were to discount the fact that you can fit more stuff behind the front seats if you're not very tall like me. Now, that aside, again, I can hear some of you going, that's not important. This is a sports car. What's inside is more important, surely. And to some extent, you'd be right, because aesthetically, this interior does look pretty good. So up front, I get a digital instrument cluster, which even comes with graphics that show off the fact this car has a horizontally opposed engine. Boxer, basically. And the little GR logo does a spin. I quite like theatrics like that. And I think that that presents itself really well in addition to this central screen, which on top of being very large and also very responsive, it's also very logically laid out, and all the buttons and the switches in here do feel rather nice. Now, Apple CarPlay and Android Auto is available. Unfortunately, it is a wired connection. You don't get a wireless connection in this car, which is probably for the better because you also don't get wireless charging. And the USB-A ports live in here. And all the buttons, like I said here, all feel really nice. You also get your dual zone climate control system down here with, again, very nice buttons and switches, but only if you're adjusting the temperature and the fan speed. Because the thing about the 86 is that, again, aesthetically, it all looks nice. You've got these lovely bucket seats with this lovely sort of microfiber material with red stitching and red panels everywhere. You get this red panel on the door and more of this microfiber material here and on the dash top. But when you start interacting with things, things start to fall apart. So the buttons here in the steering wheel all feel rather nice. You get a cruise control stalk, very Toyota. And as I mentioned earlier, to adjust the temperature and the fan speed, that's all nice. But then when you're trying to use the buttons down here for like the max AC on off and the mode switches and stuff like that, this down here feels really nasty and cheap. And the same can be said of the buttons that sit down here. You also get seat heaters, by the way, not that anyone's ever going to use that. And for something that will most likely be used quite often, I do not understand why these switches feel so flimsy. Now, the indicator stalks, this is not a dig at Tesla. The indicator stalks are a strange thing because for those of you who may or may not remember, for a generation, BMW decided that stalks don't need to sit once you've sort of hit them, so they sort of recenter no matter what. So you hit the indicator and then they go back. You hit the indicator and then they go back. Now, BMW abandoned that after one generation because literally everyone complained about how unintuitive it is to use. Simply because if I want to cancel it, that means I have to push it in the opposite direction and it just becomes really irritating. Now, Toyota has decided that, well, it's time for this technology to make a comeback because these indicator stalks don't center. Mercifully, however, they are relatively easy to cancel because simply pushing them in the opposite direction of whichever side you're indicating, if that makes sense, will shut it off, and it does so relatively reliably, and you don't end up sort of accidentally indicating to a different direction, confusing other people behind you, which is hugely appreciated. And this car also comes with automatic headlights, which means even less interaction with this infernal stalk. Unfortunately, however, the wipers in this car are not automatic. Again, this is almost 300,000 bucks. You also don't get an electronic parking brake, although this is what buyers want. What they want is this thing, so they can do it themselves, and they want this thing, so they can do it themselves. This is a lovely, snickety 6-speed manual transmission, which I must admit, the motions of which feel so lovely and smooth, and it's so easy to get it into just the right gear, although reverse is surprisingly tricky to get to. Even compared to the GR Yaris, which has a sort of purpose-built gearbox, this is a little bit more challenging to use. Now, in terms of practicality, the GR86 is surprisingly practical for a small sports car because there's a decently sized glove box in here, more than big enough to hold its sort of owner's manuals and so on. There are actually decently sized bottle holders here where you can actually put a bottle fit for human beings. There are decently sized cup holders here via a central armrest which you can close, and then it's nice and soft if you want to rest your arm on it. And of course there are those rear seats which are pretty good for extra baggage or, you know, those, what are those things called? Children. Now, if you put them back there, putting in a rear seat is going to be an absolute pain, simply because these front seats do not fold that far, and so a rear-facing child seat is an absolute no-go. But fitting the ISOFIX mounts in this car should be quite easy because the tethers are easy to locate, and so are the little feet for where you put the prongs on the child seat. I don't have children, so I don't know what any of these things are called. All I know is it'll be difficult to put stuff back there. However, a booster seat should be fine, and you know, when your kid grows out the booster seat, stop putting them in the back seat of a GR86. But again, I can hear you saying, this is a sports car, that's not important. What matters is how it drives. So, clutch in. Shall we? That's the sound of the dash cam. Now, the wonderful thing about the GR86 is that Toyota builds this as the everyday sports car, even in manual guys like this. And it does sound fantastic. So under the bonnet, gone is the old 2-litre 4-cylinder boxer engine, now replaced the 2.4-litre 4-cylinder boxer engine. So more importantly, there is a little bit more power and a significant amount more torque, but most importantly, there is now no longer a torque sort of flat spot that you used to get from the old 2-litre. That, of course, makes this a much better car to drive. And of course, if you've seen our coverage of this car at the launch in Sepang, you will know that we've already said some very nice things about the way this car drives as a track weapon. And so today, our concern lies more with how this car drives as a daily. So what I've got now is the 86 manual. We'll be driving the automatic sometime soon, and there are significant differences between the two. So being the manual, you don't get obviously the eyesight system with the ADAS functionalities, although you still get blind spot monitoring nonetheless. You also don't get rear parking sensors, which I think is a very curious omission, particularly at this price point, but that's how Toyota has decided to do it. And of course, here in the middle, instead of a 6-speed automatic gearbox, you get a 6-speed manual gearbox. Now, we've driven the Supra manual, which was a car that I didn't quite like so much on the basis that it was a little bit too focused on being a sports car, that it stopped being more capable as a GT. And for the GR86, well, on the surface, it should seem like a slightly more daily-driveable vehicle because, as we covered earlier, there are 2 back seats. The seats in the front are also very well adjustable, and you've got very good ergonomics and so on. So this has all the makings of what should be a great car to drive every day. The only trouble is this particular manual model is, well, not the greatest thing in the world. So for starters, even compared to the Supra manual, this gearbox is very close ratioed. And as a result, it means that cruising in this car is nigh on impossible, although accelerative performance is very impressive indeed. But perhaps the bigger issue compared to that is this clutch, because not only is the bite point very high, but it's also a little bit like an on-off switch, because it's either you've engaged the clutch or you've disengaged the clutch. Now that is particularly irritating when you're trying to feather the throttle and feather the clutch, especially in traffic, or when you're trying to, say, drive up a parking ramp, or even, in fact, to execute small maneuvers in order to just park. And these are all things that I didn't encounter, or at least I didn't notice while I was testing this car in Sepang, most likely because it was out on a track, and so therefore there was no real need for me to talk about it, to discuss it, or for me to explore the matter at all. But I have to say that in this, having driven it for the last 6 days, it is very noticeable. And that's me in a slightly lower gear because I'm desperately trying to save fuel. Now, aside from that, there are also other things in this car that kind of detract from its ability to be a good, usable daily car. So for starters, because this is a sports car, naturally it is very light. That is a key factor for Toyota, which means there isn't really much in the way of sound deadening. Now, I say this because when you drive over any sort of coarse surface like the ones I am driving over now in Arah Damansara, the amount of noise intrusion is significant. And in addition to that, there is also the fact that the windows themselves are also quite thin, which means as cars go by, or worse still, when bikes go by without their exhaust, you tend to notice. And of course, if you, heaven forbid, drive over any gravel, you're going to hear about it for the next 5 to 10 minutes. Now, of course, I can hear all of you screaming, why are you talking about all of these factors that apply to a daily car? This is a sports car. Sports cars are not meant to be quiet and refined and whatever. That's not the purpose of them. They're meant to be fun. And you're right, they are fun. If you go back to my coverage of the GR86 in Sepang, I will tell you that this was perhaps the most fun of all the GR cars that they launched that day. But to drive it daily presents a very different set of problems, because obviously on the track where the surface is smooth and your primary objective is about driving fast and having fun, then the GR86 is perfect. I love this car. The engine, for example, has a beautifully linear torque curve, which means figuring out just where to apply the power and figuring out how much power to apply is a very easy process indeed. And the fact that this gearbox, for example, is so very closely ratioed, it means that Moving between the gears is very easy, and of course the motion between them is so positive and it's so visceral. And of course, when you do this, it's like you've grown a third testicle. Now, that aside, the thing about the 86 is that, again, this is meant to be the daily sports car. This is supposed to be the car that sort of returns Toyota to its days of creating sports cars that could be used on a daily basis, cars that are practical and reliable and easy to use. And I feel that with this 86 manual, they've slightly missed the mark, because this car is very, very hardcore. I'm not going to get into the ride and handling, or rather the ride specifically, because obviously it is a little bit firmer than you would expect from, say, I don't know, a Civic. But obviously that is in keeping with this car, and as a result of that harsher ride, you get a very, 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 very good handling car, because man, this car is like a scalpel to drive if you find the right road. But when you're not in the mood to take in sort of winding B roads and enjoy the enthusiasm of driving, then the 86 manual does kind of fall short. And I'm kind of wondering if there'll be a difference between this and the automatic, because I can't imagine that in the auto they put more sound deadening and stuff like that to make it a little bit more refined, but perhaps for daily usability it might be more practical, especially with the eyesight system, which when we tested in the Subaru XV, we remarked as one of the best camera-based ADAS systems currently available on the market. But the bottom line with the 86 is this is not a cheap car. The Subaru BRZ, which is exactly the same thing, is significantly cheaper regardless of whether or not you go automatic or manual. And of course you do get all the same goodies, although you get a slightly different color palette if I recall correctly. But aside from that, it is the same car, and it is, as I mentioned earlier, significantly cheaper than the 86. And if you're looking for a more daily usable sports car, then I actually think that Toyota's GR Yaris is easier to drive on the daily basis. And of course, there is the fact that that being a hatchback is also significantly shorter, which means it is easier to park, rear sensors or not. But ultimately, the GR86 manual has relegated itself into the category of toys. This is a toy car. This is something that very, very wealthy people will buy for them to thrash around over the weekends or bring out with friends for a track day in Sepang or something of that sort. This is not a car for you to use every day. But the automatic might be. And so I'll reserve judgment on the auto until I can take that out. But I think this one, yeah, definitely a toy. In any case, that's been our review of the 2024 Toyota GR86 manual. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell icon to be notified every time we make a new upload. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. All the links are in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. We will catch you in the next one. Take care, stay safe, and jangan bodoh. And more importantly, don't do this. That's quite fun.